Okay, U.S. history, geography, civil rights reform in the 1960s. And we're really going to be starting as far back as the end of the war and moving up through 1968. I just want to also reiterate that this is not the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States. That had been ongoing really since Reconstruction and Jim Crow, the beginning of Jim Crow. We can talk about the civil rights movement in the United States. But what we maybe most readily associate with the civil rights movement is what we're going to get into in this chapter. This is a powerful image. It says the post-war period brought prosperity to many, but most African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens. The civil rights movement, a broad and diverse effort to attain racial equality, compelled the nation to live up to its ideal that all are created equal. The movement also demonstrated that ordinary men and women could perform extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice to achieve social justice, a lesson that continues to inspire people around the world today. This is an image of segregated drinking fountains in the South. They are a stark reminder that the ideals of equality described in the Declaration of Independence had yet to be attained. So we know that there is segregation that exists in the United States. It's written down into law in a Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson. It says that separate but equal is allowed. We're going to start our conversation about civil rights legislation in this country with the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1956 57 was designed to protect African Americans' right to vote. It included a number of important provisions to protect voting. It established a civil rights division in the Department of Justice and empowered federal officials to prosecute individuals that had conspired to deny or abridge another citizen's right to vote. It created a U.S. Civil Rights Commission that was charged with investigating allegations of voter infringement, and it signaled a growing federal commitment to the cause of civil rights. This is Eisenhower. Okay. He doesn't expect the bill to pass, but when LBJ is president, he manages to get a compromise bill through that will do all of those things. So after Eisenhower, we have John F. Kennedy, and of course his vice president will be Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson will become president after Kennedy is assassinated, and so in this chapter we're going to sort of be going back and forth between the two. There are a couple of documents in the folder that we are going to be looking at. This slide is really based off of those documents. It's not a conversation, but it's sort of two competing civil rights visions that John Lewis is going to represent and that JFK is going to represent. So we want to read both documents and be able to say whether or not we think JFK was a strong supporter of civil rights, and if we think that Lewis thinks that JFK has been supportive of the civil rights movement. Although the civil rights movement had made some gains in the 1940s, it stalled in the 1950s, in the early 1950s. One of the greatest disappointments was the NAACP's failure after decades of lobbying Congress to make the lynching of African Americans a federal crime. Feeling that the executive and legislative branches of government were unwilling to promote additional reforms, the NAACP decided to turn to litigation in the courts to attain its political goals. Thurgood Marshall will become the lawyer for the NAACP to win landmark cases against segregation, including Brown v. Board of Education, which overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, and also Sweatt and Painter, which we will be looking at as well. In 1954, each state had its own laws governing segregation in public schools. Which states required segregation in 1954? You can see all those states in purple require schools to be segregated. The orange, it was optional. The green, it was not allowed at all. And the yellow, there were no rules in the yellow. We mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court case that put separate but equal down as law. It says that segregation is okay as long as the equal facilities are provided. Of course, there's no such thing as separate and equal. The NAACP will begin to support Supreme Court cases to challenge Plessy and to challenge segregation in general. In 1935, in the case of Norris v. Alabama, it exclusion from juries, it states that exclusion from juries violates the equal right to protection, so African Americans have to serve on juries. African Americans in the NAACP will attempt to leverage political power, Northern Democrats versus Southern Democrats. They will push to end discrimination in factories during World War II, and they will establish something called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer and George Hauser in 1942. And as early as the mid-40s, that group is going to be staging sit-ins as a form of protest. Another image of Thurgood Marshall. He's an important legal mind of the civil rights era, the chief counsel for the NAACP, who focuses on ending segregation in public schools. The case of Brown v. Board of Education is probably the most significant civil rights legislation of the 50s, or not legislation, but Supreme Court case, because this is the quote from the Chief Justice, Earl Warren. He says, "We conclude that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." So after 1954, segregation in public schools is supposed to be over. Now, it will take more work and more fighting for that to actually come to fruition in many places in the South. This is a chart based on Brown v. Board of Education. Think about what ways the graphs are related and be able to cite evidence to support the claim that school desegregation improved the lives of minorities in the United States. So as segregation starts to go away, we start to see more African Americans attending college, less African Americans dropping out of school, and a higher level of African American income. This image is always really striking to me. This is an image of one of the Little Rock Nine, one of the kids who integrates the Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas after Brown v. Board in 1957. And this woman in the background who's yelling at her, I mean, live your life so that you're not in a picture like that, right? We are going to have a separate lesson about these two women, Elizabeth Eckford and the woman who is behind her yelling. So stay tuned for that in your folder. Massive resistance. So massive resistance is the opposition to integration. As Brown v. Board, makes segregation illegal, essentially, the government orders that the South desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. I mean, what does that even mean? Do you have to go quickly? Can you drag your feet? So people in the South the governments in the South don't just drag their feet, they move as slowly as possible. And they say we're going to resist massive resistance. It's the white response to the civil rights movement. We're going to fight this tooth and nail. And so it will be in 1969 when the government will say, actually, you must desegregate at once. You must desegregate immediately. This image up here in the top right, I have lost 4 years of education. Why 5? Let's tell Russia about this. This is a really interesting strategy that African Americans protesting segregation will use to say, what would they think about this in Russia? And in Russia, their propaganda says, America isn't free. Look at the way they treat their minority groups. In addition to legal efforts during this era, some civil rights activists took direct action to end segregation. This is December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress, boards a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sits in an empty chair. The bus driver asks her to give up her seat to a white passenger. By law, she was supposed to do that, and she refuses. She will be arrested. The policeman, she says, quote, asked if the driver had asked me to stand up, and I said yes, and they wanted to know why I didn't. I told them I didn't think I should have to stand up after I had paid my fare and occupied a seat. I didn't think I should have to give it up. So that happens on December 1st, 1955. There is then a call to boycott the entire bus system. It will be led by a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association, and that group is led by a man named Martin Luther King Jr., a very young pastor and advocate of nonviolent protest methods. In November of 1956, after a boycott of the system, the Supreme Court rules that the Montgomery bus laws are illegal. This demonstrates that nonviolence can accomplish goals. In 1957, we have the formation of the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they will focus on registering African Americans to vote.
Like all cities in the South, Montgomery, Alabama had segregated buses. In interstate buses like this one, and in city buses, the whites sat in the front, the blacks in back. If more whites got on, the blacks had to give them the middle and back seats too. 3 months after the Till trial, Rosa Parks, a secretary for the NAACP, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger.
And when the policeman approached me, one of them spoke and asked me if the driver had asked me to stand. I said, yes. He said, why don't you stand up? I said, I don't think I should have to stand up. And I asked him, I said, why do you push us around? He said, I do not know, but the law is a law and you're under arrest.
There had been arrest before. The black community was well organized and was now ready to respond. Leaders called for a boycott of city buses.
The people wanted to continue that boycott. They had been touched by the persecution, the humiliation that many of them had endured on buses, and they voted for it unanimously, and that meant thousands of people.
At regular mass rallies, the community constantly renewed its strength through song, prayer, and the encouragement of its ministers.
This show is your show. Not only is this show the show of Negroes in Montgomery, but this is the show of Negroes all over America.
The man they elected to help lead them was a new preacher in town, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old.
We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong.
Before the boycott, 2/3 of the bus riders were black. After December 5th, there were almost no blacks at the segregated bus stops or on the buses. Many wondered how long would it take.
We thought that you could just shame America. So now, America, look at your promises. Look at how you're treating your poor Negro citizens. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. But you know, segregate. You can't shame segregation. You can't. Rattlesnakes don't commit suicide.
Month after month, the boycott continued. A wave of violence began. Shots were fired at city buses. Bombs were thrown at the homes of black boycott leaders, including Dr. King's.
Are you afraid?
No, I'm not. My attitude is that this is a great cause. It is a great issue that we are confronted with. And I have always felt that ultimately along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it.
The boycotters rode black taxis. They organized a community carpool system. Mostly, they walked. After 11 months, it was the United States Supreme Court that finally broke the deadlock. The court ruled unanimously that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional.
The decision rendered by the Supreme Court yesterday was a victory. Yeah. But it wasn't a victory for colored folks. Don't make that victory that small. It wasn't a victory for 50,000 Negroes in Montgomery. It wasn't merely a victory for 16 million Negroes of America. That was a victory for justice.
We had won self-respect, and if you have never had the feeling to feel that this is not the other man's country and you are an alien in it, but that this is your country too, then you don't know what I'm talking about. But it is a hilarious feeling that just goes all over you, that makes you feel that America is a great country and we're going to do more to make it greater.
To be continued.